Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Lorenzo Vidino. I'm the director of the program on extremism at the George Washington University. And it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event, Prevent and Countering Violent Extremism, UK and US Perspectives, which the program on extremism is co-hosting together with our great partners at the UK's Counter-Extremism Group and the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education, NSITE. The event of today comes on the heels of the recent release of the independent review of Prevent, led by William Shawcross, which drew much attention in the UK and beyond over the last few weeks. And so the question is, why is Prevent important? And why is it so well beyond the UK? Well, we'll discuss that today, but I would preliminarily start saying that is because, for better or for worse, Prevent is the forerunner and the model of all CVE strategies, particularly in the West. It was created by the UK government almost 20 years ago, and it has gone through many iterations, undergoing substantial changes in scope, in underlying philosophy, and many aspects of its implementation. The Shawcross review is just the latest episode in this long history, and many of the issues outlined in it are common to most Western countries who work on prevention. From our perspective, it also gives us an opportunity to revamp a bit the debate on CVE in America, a topic that has always attracted substantial debate and controversy for sure, but has never led to the creation of an extensive strategy like Prevent. So we have a lot to discuss, and I'm delighted that we can do that with a group of top-class experts from both sides of the pond, who also happen to be good friends of the program. So let me briefly introduce them in the order in which we are going to be speaking. And first of all, we have our very own Alex Meleagro Hitchens, who is the research director here at POE, but is also a professor at King's College London. He spends part of his time in the UK, part in the US. He's a dual citizen, so perfectly qualified to speak about US and UK. He's also been following Prevent basically since it was created, if that doesn't date you, Alex. After him, we will hear from Hannah Stewart, who is the director of the Counter-Extremism Group in the UK, our partners today. Last week, I was in a panel in London with Hannah. It was an event organized by the Commission on Countering Extremism, where the Home Secretary gave a very important speech on extremism. And Hannah described herself, I'm paraphrasing here, as one of those annoying think tankers who always find flaws in things like Prevent. If I'm not mistaken, that's how you describe yourself. I think that's a perfect tongue-in-cheek way of putting it. But seriously, I think Hannah has long done great work and a great service to the British government and public with all her work on Prevent and other extremism-related matters. So we're delighted to have her. After Hannah, we're going to hear comments from Rashad Ali, who needs no introduction, but I'll nonetheless do one because he deserves it. And also because I think he will speak to us more about his library in the back, and I think that's what we want to hear mostly. But Rashad is knowledgeable on many topics. He's a fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a British think tank that has recently established a presence in the US. So I encourage people in the US to pay attention to what ISD will be doing over here, as I'm sure it will reflect a lot of the excellent work that it has long done in Europe. Rashad was once a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, is an accomplished theologian, has long worked as a prevention practitioner in the UK. So the list of accomplishments is very long. After Rashad, we will move to Liam Duffy, who is a strategic advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project, not to be confused with the Counter-Extremism Group, different organization, equally good. Also used to work as a Prevent practitioner. Liam frequently writes extremely thought-provoking pieces in Unheard, The Spectator, and other publications, often pulling no punches, and I'm sure he will do the same today with us. Last, but definitely not least, we're going to hear from Brett Steele, who's the Senior Director for Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Before that, Brett served many positions in the federal government, and she has arguably been one of the most active and authoritative voices in the US CVE debate. So I look forward to hearing from her, mostly on the US perspective on things. So before we start, just a couple of remarks on logistics. We will first have a round of prepared remarks from each speaker. I would say around 7 minutes each, which I will enforce with the precision that is rarely attributed to Italians. Then a second round of questions asked by me and possibly some debate among the speakers. Then what we will do is that we will open it to questions from the audience. So to anybody that has tuned in, feel free to write your questions and we will ask them in the last 20, 30 minutes of the event. So let's get started without further ado. And let me start with Alex. Alex recently wrote a great report for the Counter-Extremism group that looks at how Prevent has been framed in the debate. We will discuss that. But I would say before we get to that, Alex, why don't you give us a general overview of what is Prevent, its evolution, the latest Shawcross review? I think that's important. So for everybody also outside the UK in the audience to be on the same page. Why don't we start from the basics?
Sure. Thanks, Lorenzo. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, so I'm going to try and cover what is almost now 20 years of history of this program. Beginning in around 2003, the UK, in response to 9/11, developed something called Contest, which is their counterterrorism strategy, and it was defined by what they call the 4 Ps: pursue, protect, prepare, and prevent. The first 3 are kind of your standard hard power counterterrorism measures: stopping terrorists, investigating them, setting up your infrastructure to be resilient to terrorist attacks, these type of things. But it included now this prevent component. Essentially, the first time a counterterrorism strategy of any type included this soft power element: stop people becoming terrorists through soft power. It was more of an idea that wasn't that fleshed out at the start. So Prevent emerges around 2006, and we can kind of divide it into 3 stages. The first Prevent, which kind of went from 2006 to 2011, was run by the Department for Communities and Local Government. The idea here was that through empowering community, or through encouraging integration and community cohesion, you could prevent radicalization. So essentially it looked to fund and empower grassroots organizations that were supposedly helping kids, prevent them from being pulled into extremism. And that included funding sports teams, religious centers, mosques, things like this. About 48 million pounds was spent in funding these type of projects. And yeah, it put community cohesion and integration right at the center of counter-extremism. It was criticized for a number of reasons, and it adapted as a result. One of the main early critiques to come out was that it focused solely on Islamism and jihadism. In fact, the way it prioritized areas of the UK to fund was that if there was 5% or more Muslims in that area. So it soon started receiving a lot of criticism for creating so-called suspect communities amongst Muslims. It was also criticized for trying to empower so-called non-violent Islamists by funding them in some cases as sort of bulwarks against violent extremists. But overall, one of the things that was found, I think widely agreed on, was that it essentially kind of, what the term that's used is sort of securitized the relationship between the state and British Muslims. So this kind of the first major outreach the British state makes towards Muslims in the UK is on the basis of them being potentially terrorists. And this, in a way, sort of poisoned the well a little bit as far as the relationship between those communities and the government, sort of developed. And so it received its first review. So we're talking about now the second review most recently, but this first review was in 2011 by Lord Carlisle. And essentially we come into Prevent 2 at this point. Everything past 2011 is a new version of Prevent. It changes a few things. It drops mostly this community cohesion angle. It says that we shouldn't confuse community cohesion with counterterrorism. It drops much of this grassroots organization and local funding. And It also started arguing that it needs to focus not just on violent extremism, but also so-called non-violent extremism. And it had to sort of do more in the sort of ideological space, the battle of ideas. It also introduced this idea of defining extremism around rejection of so-called British values, including tolerance, democracy, pluralism. So it started trying to encourage organizations to promote British values as a bulwark against extremism. It moved away from being controlled by the Department of Communities and Local Government to the Office for Security and Counterterrorism, sort of showing this move away from community cohesion. And it kind of pretty much became defined by its most important program, which was the Channel Project. This is essentially an intervention project based on referrals from the local community and from local services, schools, hospitals, police. Essentially, individuals who are showing signs of extremism are referred to this program, and if they are accepted, they voluntarily come into it, and some type of intervention is developed to try to steer them away before they commit a crime, before they get into violent radicalization. So that kind of defines that second phase of PREVENT. It was this intervention-focused, channel-focused. The third PREVENT, which is kind of where we are now, emerges in 2015, 2016, and is defined by something called the PREVENT duty. Again, PREVENT was not just the first program to do a sort of official soft power counterterrorism. It was also the first time that this legal duty is established. And essentially, the government says that now public institutions, especially schools, have a legal duty to have in place a system to refer individuals in that organization to channel, to prevent and to channel. It wasn't a legal duty to make referrals, but a legal duty to have in place a system that makes that referral possible and make sure that your staff are aware of how that's done. Your staff are trained in order to be equipped to refer people if they need to. So it's the first time any country has developed this sort of legal requirement, and it based this all around this idea of safeguarding. So now radicalization and counter-radicalization work is being presented as safeguarding in the same way perhaps that you protect children from sexual abuse or other things like this, domestic abuse. It started presenting radicalization as a safeguarding issue. And again, a big focus on still and kind of doubling down on this idea of promoting British values through this. And in fact, the British definition of extremism largely revolves around a rejection of British values. One of the things that really inspired the PREVENT duty to try to put pressure on institutions was the Syrian foreign fighter phenomenon that emerged around that time, particularly British school kids, most famously schoolgirls from London, like Shamima Begum, going and joining at a very young age, joining ISIS abroad. They wanted to develop a system that put a bit more pressure on schools to be more active and involved in preventing kids from joining ISIS. And very quickly, because I'm probably running out of time here, the PREVENT review. So we're now in this sort of post-review phase, the latest one, 2023. It included a number of critiques, a number of recommendations. One of the areas it's quite critical on is that it believes that PREVENT has now the balance of what it focuses on is shifted so much to the extreme right that it's too focused on the extreme right threat, whereas the original criticism that it was too focused on the jihadi threat. It still believes, the reviewer, William Shawcross, still believes that money is going to extremist groups. He also believes that we shouldn't treat people who are being radicalized as sort of vulnerable victims who require safeguarding. He wants to focus more on their ideology and more on their sort of personal agency and putting more responsibility in the hands of people who are radicalized. And also a belief that still not enough is being done to counter so-called nonviolent extremism. And some interesting observations as well. Huge amount of anti-Semitism involved in many of the channel referrals from all types of extremism, something he points out. And also he's keen to point out that there's this sort of anti-PREVENT sort of disinformation campaign and lobby groups that are sort of skewing in the public's mind what PREVENT really is. There's plenty of other things which we will be discussing and agreeing and disagreeing on for the rest of the panel, but I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect, Alex. That's perfect. That's a perfect introduction. I think we now have a better understanding of the evolution of PREVENT, and you brought it to, contemporary debates. And Hannah, I'll leave it to you to explain what do you think the review got right, what it got wrong? I think we have different views on this panel, so let's start with you. Fire it up.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Good morning, everyone. My name's Hannah, and I'm the director of the Counter-Extremism Group. It's a real pleasure to join you all for today's discussion. I guess I should just say, full disclosure, I was involved, albeit in a very small way, in the review. In 2019, I was interviewed by the first reviewer, and then under William Shawcross, I also took part in some workshops for academics and think tankers that fed into the review. So Lorenzo asked me beforehand to focus on what I think the Shawcross review got right. And so I'd like to just make 5 very brief remarks about that. First, Shawcross says that Prevent has lost its focus on stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. In my view, he's right in his diagnosis of mission creep. So he finds, and he's not the first reviewer to find this, he finds that Prevent has funded an awful lot of community cohesion work that has very little to do with stopping people from supporting terrorism. So theatre groups and sports clubs tackling drug abuse and unemployment. Are these noble aims? Yes. But do they prevent terrorism? I'm not so sure. And the Home Office was not able to provide Shawcross with any evidence that they had done so. So William Shawcross also found that the Prevent referral system, to his mind, had been increasingly focused on personal vulnerabilities, things like housing or mental health or education. He said, and I quote here, that this had resulted in an overemphasis on vulnerability and an underemphasis of ideology. He believed this to be the case to the point where ideology was not seen as a necessary condition, when in UK law, it is a necessary condition of terrorism. So like Shawcross, I think that's wrong. And I worry in particular that it can lead to Prevent staff not being properly trained and not having a proper understanding of extremist ideologies and their role in inspiring terrorism. Second, the review identified a disparity between the type of Prevent referrals and the terrorism threat picture in the UK. The figures here are particularly stark. So 80% of counterterrorism police investigations focus on Islamist threats, yet just 1/5 of referrals in the year to 2021 concerned Islamism. So it's an inversion of the threat. You might ask why that's the case. William Shawcross offered 4 explanations for this. One, he thought Prevent was carrying the weight for overstretched mental health services. 2, changes in the way that we record complex or unclear referrals, leading to people possibly being referred unnecessarily or incorrectly. 3, a politicized requirement to be seen to emphasizing work on the far right. 4, a possible underreporting of Islamist cases. Now, I can't comment personally on all of those, but I do recognize some of what William Shawcross describes from my time working at the Commission for Countering Extremism, which is an arm's length body to the Home Office. While I was there, it was from among the officials I worked with, it was seen as useful to emphasize the work that the government does on challenging the far right, and particularly useful to do this in a way to be seen to be rebutting criticism of Prevent stigmatizing Muslim communities. It was not uncommon to hear in the drafting of a speech or a press release somebody saying, well, yeah, but what's our far right example? Third, Prevent, to William Shawcross, has gotten to a place where it's operating a double standard when dealing with extreme right-wing and Islamism cases. So what he compared was what he found to be quite an expansive approach to the far right, including people and trends most people wouldn't think was to do with terrorism. He compared that to a much narrower focus on Islamism that was often just around international prescribed terrorist organizations and didn't so much look at UK-based Islamist groups or narratives. He saw this double standard in both research and training products from the government, and both in the content that they covered and the volume of the resources that were allocated to the different threats. He puts this disparity down to a nervousness around talking about subjects to do with Islamist ideology and this need that we've mentioned before about emphasizing work on the far right. I agree with his calls to recalibrate Prevent, to move away from that and to better match the threat. When I read the recommendations he has specifically on this, it's clear to me that he's not saying do less on the far right. This isn't about playing ideologies off against one another. It seems to me he's calling for one single service level across Prevent, and that his aim is to ensure that Prevent is consistent and proportionate in how it tackles the different threats. So that's something I very much agree with. Fourth, he exposes how Prevent has at times funded or engaged Islamist-linked groups and individuals. The Home Secretary has since pledged that this ends on her watch. So a lot of things that she's pledged will end on her watch. I remain a bit skeptical about this. This isn't, Shawcross's review is not the first review to find that Prevent has funded people who've legitimized extremism. To me, these funding and engagement mistakes appear endemic. When I worked in the civil service, I often observed a kind of mindset, and I think at times I was probably guilty of this too. This mindset that sees the process of engagement as positive in and of itself. It's quite rare to hear officials question the extremism risk of engagement, let alone ask what the purpose particularly of the engagement is, or to think about what the other party's objectives or agenda might be. And that can lead you to engage with groups and individuals, particularly in the Islamist space. You think as the government that you're engaging with mainstream Muslim organizations, but actually you can find yourself working with or listening to people who their support perhaps for Islamist causes means that they find themselves unable to condemn violence by groups abroad, such as Hamas, or groups who are very critical, for example, of Muslims who take money from the government and call them collaborators. So I very much agree with William Shawcross that these groups are not appropriate partners for government. And fifth, defending Prevent from dishonest actors. So William Shawcross was very clear that the kind of widespread perception that Prevent is toxic comes in part from an organized disinformation campaign by several groups, many of whom are Islamist in nature. And he distinguishes this campaign from a more general opposition to counterterrorism policies on, for example, civil liberties grounds. And to him, this Islamist-led campaign can cause an awful lot of damage within Muslim communities by discouraging engagement with Prevent or stirring up a sense of grievance. He argues that Prevent and those deliver it must be protected from these dishonest actors. I agree with that. So to sum up, the Prevent review is not an easy read for government. It describes a bloated and, I guess, besieged programme that has lost focus. But it does also provide a path forward. And there are 34 recommendations. They've been accepted in full by the government. For me, I think it won't be enough for the government to just tick off those 34 recommendations. William Shawcross is not the first independent advisor to observe a kind of squeamishness around talking about Islamist extremism, and to observe that that can hamper efforts. When I worked with Sarah Khan, the Commissioner for Countering Extremism, I saw that for myself. I think that a culture change is required. And I think to do that, the government needs to embed, the government and everybody working in Prevent needs to embed not just the letter of these 34 recommendations, but the spirit of the Shawcross review.
Excellent. Thank you, Hannah. This is very, very interesting observations on the review. Before we move to Rashad, who I know has a more negative, perhaps, perception on it. I did ask Hannah to be more. No, but I need to push people. But you need to be to tell me the parts she supports, and Rashad to be the sort of highlighting the negatives. Before we move to Rashad, I'd like to just encourage the audience again to send in, to type their questions. We already got a couple. But we will open to questions later, but you can already start typing those questions for the panelists. So Rashad, for your contrarian take, or whatever take, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you to everybody else on the panel. Actually, it should be an interesting conversation. Actually, I have some critical takes, and I have some things that I think are maybe not fair takes on the review, but they're more criticisms of the broader policy. But just before that, there's a few things I wanted to say very quickly, just to come back on some of the comments that have been made. So yes, Prevent started off, or contest started off, to challenge Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism, and that's how it was worded. So it wasn't even broadly speaking challenging Islamism, it was Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism. And so in that context, it was very, very restrictive, which meant it wasn't actually dealing with extremism at all. And it wasn't dealing with explicitly Northern Irish terrorism, nationalist-inspired terrorism, etc. At least that was the policy framework. However, it wasn't ring-fenced, meaning it didn't stop local authorities utilizing the funding on Prevent dealing with those issues, and they actually did. So even though in origin it wasn't dealing with the far right, local areas like areas that I worked on in Derbyshire, East Midlands, etc., they also recognized they had a fairly distinct far right problem and dealt with some of the far right issues as well. And that's what provided, if you like, a framework for afterwards saying, something, we do, and we should mainstream dealing with the far right as part of the Prevent counterterrorism process. Just as a minor thing, Prevent was divided between Home Office and what was then CLG, and the CT aspect was owned by the Home Office, i.e. the aspect that was looking at stopping individuals becoming radicalized into terrorism was managed by the Home Office, and the aspect that Alex pointed out in terms of preventing the community and building resilience within the community from supporting terrorism was handled by CLG, communities and local government. And it's that which was then moved into the Home Office and seen as a much more securitized approach to saying, we're going to deal with issues of social integration, social cohesion, etc., under this broader counterterrorism umbrella, and therefore this securitization, if you like, of engagement with communities and integration became a whole debate in a more exacerbated form. Again, the issue then became, how do we deal with it? And it became recognized that actually Prevent was dealing with both the Salafi or the Puritan strands, if you like, of Muslims that were very religious, puritanical, very conservative, but anti-violent, and also the more, I guess what I would say is the more mainstreamed offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, softer ends of the Muslim Brotherhood spectrum and Islamists who had taken part in the initial community cohesion-related counter-extremism / related actions, which were really not counter-extremism. They were aimed at putting out propaganda, disassociating Islam from terrorism, and also all the other kind of projects which were mentioned, which were, if you like, often sometimes soft delivery of Islam. And so that review curved all those types of activities, attempted to focus it, and that's what came about, this whole discussion about who do we work with then? And that's where the Home Office had a set of values. And it was actually the Department of Education that framed it British values. And that might have had something to do with who was leading the Department of Education at the time, because the Home Office left it as kind of like a set of values that they hold on to, which was, I mentioned, the rule of law, democracy, basic human rights, which might be seen as ironic with the current government in place in the UK, and also not some people that don't support attacks on British troops. And so then it became specifically focused on Islamist ideology and looking at the far right. And it's this context that I think not defining those terms clearly enough leads to a kind of ambiguity about who we're going to deal with, what the scope is. And in that context, I think, just to kind of respond to some of the points that Hannah kind of put forward, it is true there's a disproportionate referral process between the far right and Islamists, and there are all sorts of ambiguities there. But I think to be sympathetic to, this is an area I've worked in for a long time, over a decade, as a delivery of channel interventions. Actually, that ambiguity exists on Islamist referrals. I've had some of the most ridiculous requests for, can you speak to this young man who's, his parents want you to speak to him because he's converted to Islam from a Hindu family. And I've had to politely say, this really isn't something relevant for Prevent. It really isn't anything to do with Islamism, or even really anything to do with extremism or terrorism in any way whatsoever. Also, yes, I understand and appreciate there is going to be a lack of clarity about how to deal with what I see as a social and political problem, not necessarily a security problem with the far right. And I think that is to do with the nature of the strategy itself, which I'll come back to in a second. And also, I think this is really a debate regarding, and it's been a consistent debate, does PREVENT deal with extremism or only terrorism? And because actually the process of PREVENT is under the banner of counterterrorism, the ambiguity in dealing with extremism, which is not terrorism, means there is an ambiguity about early intervention and early engagement. When do you decide somebody is expressing extremist rhetoric and therefore being radicalized and should have an intervention? Or when is it that it's just extreme, nasty, horrid, maybe even not horrid, but politically of a particular persuasion? And when it's just a social cohesion issue? There is an ambiguity in that. And I think just to be kind of sympathetic to frontline staff, I think that's one of the reasons. And yes, I think frontline staff will tell you they do fear being branded as, you know, an Islamophobe or a racist, and therefore there will be some fears about this. That's just, you know, I often hear people will ask me for reassurance because they have this kind of, and I often tell others, please tell them, speak to me if they do feel that they're going to be branded in this way. I'll provide support, counseling, or whatever it is that's necessary, because it is quite a challenging area. And lastly, I think the scale of the issues. The scale of the recruitment from the far right is much bigger than the scale of recruitment from Islamists, and therefore there is going to be this ambiguity. That doesn't explain it, and that doesn't justify it, but I think there are those mitigating factors to this problem. I think it is easier just to refer someone from the far right than it is from an Islamist perspective. In terms of, you know, the points that Hannah mentioned regarding the abuse, I think, of the failures of mainstream services and abuse of prevention resources, I think there is more money in counterterrorism and there's a lack of funding for mainstream services. And sadly, that's a bigger structural issue that is being, you know, PREVENT is being used almost to fill in those gaps. In terms of coming back to the point I was making around a strategic problem, I actually think there is a strategic problem with dealing with the far right. The nature of the far right as a problem is not as big as a security issue. That's not to say there aren't serious cases. There are cases. It is on the perceived radar, and I was even being informed about this as recently as, you know, an hour ago regarding certain areas where there's particular cases that are being looked at. That is true. However, broadly speaking, the nature of the far right is a socio-political problem. It's one that seeks to undermine our values, basic human rights, the rule of law, our identity, and what it is enshrined in our law, whether it's protecting characteristics of sexuality, identity, orientation, race, and so on, or undermining basic human rights and the rule of law. And the problem with that is shifting the political discourse to making extremist discourse in our mainstream, in our societies. You know, Lorenzo, you mentioned we were at this conference last week and we had European practitioners come and speak. They managed to speak about extremism in Europe and not talk about the percentage of votes that Le Pen managed to get in the last election in France, or the percentage of votes the Austrian Nazi Party got in Austria in the last elections, which are huge. And so the actual problems there are social problems. And so we need to move in outside of counterterrorism. And I think that for me is a key concern. And then the other issues with the review I had were actually more to do with, yes, of course, there is going to be erroneous engagement with Islamists and conservatives who don't share the values that we espouse. I don't think that's a policy failure. I think that's a structural problem, partly to do with the nature of, you know, Hannah explained it very well. It's very difficult. There are lots of reasons why this happens, but also the challenges in doing so. I think it just needs more attention to detail, more upskilling, more staff, and better training. All of those things are necessary in order to stop things like that happening. And the last thing is regarding, okay, how do we, you know, deal with the PREVENT critics? Well, actually, some of the PREVENT critics have reasonable criticisms The ones who are disingenuous are the ones who are ideologically aligned to supporting extremist groups. And we need to be very clear about who they are. And lastly, we need to recognize, of course, there are going to be issues where there are challenges with transparency versus tactical rationale for not necessarily, being open and having transparency about who the people are. And I know the Home Office struggles with what level of transparency and communication it should have with the public in addressing some of the utterly, absolutely false propaganda that's put out by these people. Sometimes just straight lies, sometimes manipulation of actual cases, and sometimes just through strategic holding back of information. So it's one thing to talk about an individual who had their child taken away because there was a referral. It's another thing to say that a supporter of ISIS and someone who was actively involved in proselytizing ISIS ideology, involved with al-Muhajirun, and a violent perpetrator against his wife and family had their child taken away as a safeguarding measure that had nothing to do with Prevent. But again, explaining all of that once the cat is out of the bag is harder. So I am sympathetic to that, but I think there should be more done in that regard. I'm going to end there with just one last point, which is I agree with the view that was taken by, I'm going to get his name wrong, I think it's Jonathan Lawrence. A lot of the far-right individuals that are being referred to young kids saying stupid things are very similar to the young Islamist kids saying stupid things. We need more off-ramps for these individuals rather than prosecutions for the remote, which I think we need to be very carefully look at this. And that's a broader CT application problem than just Prevent.
Excellent. Thank you, Rashad. Really appreciate it. You touched a lot of very interesting points. I think that we already got quite a few questions based on your remarks. Appreciate that. Let me quickly move to Liam. Liam, as I said earlier, was a Prevent practitioner, so seen it on the ground. Would love to hear his thoughts about the state of Prevent, the review. What's right, what's wrong, what could be done better in general?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I guess I will give my opinion, which was formed over a decade ago, like seeing some of this on the ground, which I appreciate is a while ago, but since then have been involved in Prevent projects and close to the sector, broadly speaking, and also around the time this review was getting underway, interviewed about 10 practitioners as well about their expectations for the review and things like that. And yeah, because I'm turning into a bit of a curmudgeon, my views haven't changed too much in the last 10 years since I observed them. So I guess I'll talk about where the review overlaps and where it doesn't, but mainly just talk about my observations. I think it's important to talk about exactly what we mean here, first of all. So like when the review says, and when we say Prevent is doing X or Prevent isn't doing Y, what do we actually mean? And I think there's the piece of paper, which is the Prevent strategy, and there's what the ministers want. And there's a lot of space between that and what might get delivered under the guise of Prevent or badged as Prevent in a local community setting, in a library, in a primary school, working with teachers who are maybe not even all of them, but volunteers and community groups that are not even all full-time and things like that. There is a lot of layers between that. And I think there's a lot of distance between that. And sometimes what's being done in those settings is phenomenal and fantastic and really well-meaning. And some of it, as the review and as Hannah and Rashad have both mentioned, some of it I think does get away from what the strategy's intended purpose is, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. The first bit I'll point out is, and I know Lorenzo, you might shake your head because you know that I'm a complete broken record on this, but I think the bit, and I've always thought this, the main failing of Prevent, or not failing, the flaw, it's not a failing, it's a flaw of Prevent in its current guise, is its framing of radicalization as something that affects the vulnerable and the misled or the naive. And I think that's really, really problematic for a few different reasons. But I think it all plays into a broader picture of how, all those layers that I mentioned, from the piece of paper to the ministers, to the civil servants, to what's getting delivered on the ground under the guise of Prevent or badged as Prevent, I think has become slightly disconnected from the reality of the terrorism picture in the United Kingdom. And as I said, the first bit of that is to do with vulnerability. And it goes back to Alex's really good description of how the inception of Prevent. And I think it was the only way that there was a mechanism to deliver it was to position it alongside safeguarding mechanisms for, other social ills that Alex mentioned. So, gangs, drugs, domestic violence, things like that. So in order to position it like that, but also in order to get buy-in and public support from the kind of professionals, frontline professionals who ordinarily might object to counterterrorism legislation being part of their day job, was to frame it much more as a safeguarding issue, as something, if somebody's vulnerable to all X, Y, and Z, they might also be vulnerable to radicalization too. And I think because of the settings in which Prevent is delivered, that's created a bit of a feedback loop. So the main places it's been delivered, the main vectors of delivery are things like mental health and health services, are the education sector, are youth offending, all these different services that exist in local authorities. So the type of people that those services and frontline professionals are interacting with, they really might be people with various sources of instability in their lives. But I would question whether they're the type of people who are actually the terror threat in this country, in the United Kingdom. I think that's the disconnect there. So I know that, I've had all sorts of practitioners say, well, I've dealt with this case and this person had all sorts of vulnerabilities, therefore, it's a vulnerability issue. It's like, well, no, is that the type of person that you're interacting with, rather than the type of person who's likely to join a terrorist group in the United Kingdom? And I think I've linked to this and slightly aside, I think last Thursday or Friday, the Manchester Arena inquiry was published, which looked at Salman Abedi's radicalization. And it really got me thinking about this Prevent's framing of radicalization as like this transformative process that almost tacitly assumes that somebody was like a law-abiding democratic citizen one day and then underwent this transformative process and came out the other end a terrorist. And if you look at Salman Abedi's case and if you look at this inquiry, that's not what happened at all. There was no finite process in his life, which you might identify as radicalization, where there might be a chance to intervene. So I would just question whether Prevent really has an answer for that type of case, which actually seems to mirror a lot of the generation of people from Britain and around Europe who supported ISIS. There were more, Lorenzo, you know this better than anybody, more kind of people who were born into a more kind of extremist milieu or ecosystem of various words that have been used in different European contexts. There's that transformative finite process doesn't seem to exist in a lot of those cases. And I think Prevent needs to think long and hard about whether it has an answer for that type of case, especially going into the future. So yeah, like I said, I think it's doing a fine job of diverting the people who might fit the bill as vulnerable away from its terrorism, but I would question whether it has access to people who are confident and stable in their convictions enough to be considering violence. I also think that discourse has seeped into broader counterterrorism efforts, and it's really quite urgent when you think about things like de-radicalization. So given the amount of returnees from ISIS, given the number of imprisoned extremists in Britain and other European contexts, if we have a kind of flawed notion of how people become radicalized, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence for our ability to de-radicalize, if that makes sense. So I think that's a way in which it affects broader counterterrorism efforts. But then also I think, and I've talked about this before, you now see stranded and captured ISIS recruits in northern Syria, in camps or in prisons. And I'm not just talking about Shamima Begum here, who's a bit of an outlier. They're now kind of able to play back our own tropes and mythology about radicalization, about how they volunteered for this group. So these are people who are involved in some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, now saying that they were vulnerable and misled and manipulated or brainwashed by online propaganda. And they're able to use back our own assumptions and mythology back to us, and I think that's extremely damaging, not to mention egregious on their part, given what they're involved in. You get a similar story with the constructing a narrative of the terror threat based on what Prevent is doing with the focus on children and young people. There's a massive focus on schools, and if you look at referrals, a lot of referrals come from the education sector and involve children and young people, and that again catches us in a bit of a feedback loop where we think, okay, there's a lot of referrals for children and young people, therefore there's a risk for children and young people. But it shouldn't really be surprising that the majority of referrals come from the education sector, given that that's one of the main vectors of delivery, and it's been a legal duty for schools, as Alex mentioned, since 2015. So again, I think we're caught in a feedback loop, which brings me to, I guess, what was probably the most contentious point of the review, which was about the proportionate focus on Islamism relative to the far right. And I think you can see a similar thing here, where referral statistics are taken as like an objective proxy for the terror threat in the United Kingdom, when that's not necessarily the case. Referral statistics for Prevent are much more a reflection of the things that we're focused on, if that makes sense. The resources and focus on a particular problem. They're not an objective measure of the threat. I also think that on that note, I've seen some of the pushback and some of the consternation from practitioners and other academics on the Prevent review, but I haven't really seen this point engaged with, because as Hannah said, to my mind, I never interpreted the review as saying, don't focus on the far right, neglect the far right, overlook the far right. It doesn't say that at any point. It doesn't say, if in 5-10 years, the far right is the main problem, it shouldn't respond in that way. I think the main thing for me was about where those, as Rash said, they're really ambiguous, but where those boundaries lie for how they're defined. And I've sat through, I'll give my own experience. So back in 2014-15, when we had literally hundreds of Britons going to Syria to join ISIS, there was almost this need to create a false parity with the groups like the English Defence League at the time. You speak to practitioners and they felt kind of under pressure to talk about the EDL as much as they did ISIS in parts of London, for example, where there was literally no English Defence League presence whatsoever, but they still felt the need to devote equal time and resources to talking about them in presentations and in training sessions and things like that. I'd say that phenomenon has really accelerated massively in the last few years, to the point where it's not even about the EDL or Britain First anymore. It's about all sorts of, I've sat through conferences and training sessions that mention mainstream conservative commentators who, no matter how odious you might find their views, they're not advocating anything resembling violence. So I think the critics of this portion of the review need to really make the case about whether that's an appropriate thing to be in the purview of a counterterrorism strategy. Mainstream conservative commentators who are a long, long way away from advocating violence, or whether Daily Mail headlines should be on a slide straight after Dabiq front covers Islamic State's propaganda magazine. And I'm not being facetious. Like, that's not uncommon. That is the kind of thing that you see. So I think that's what we need to engage with about whether that's appropriate. If you think that that's appropriate, then make that case. Don't say, oh, the review is downplaying the far right. If you think that somebody like Douglas Murray should be in the purview of a counterterrorism strategy, then make that case. Don't say that the review is ignoring or neglecting the far right. Where I depart a little bit on the review, and this kind of backs up what Rash was saying, was I would agree that it needs to really go back to basics and be about preventing, potentially the next Salman Abedi or the next Thomas Mayer, who the far right terrorist, not, the next online shit poster or the next Andrew Tate fan, for example. That's not what it should be about. It needs to go back to basics. And I think any prevention strategy worth its salt should kind of exist quietly in the background and able to kick in when there is a real risk, and not in kind of trivial cases where there's not really a risk of violence. And again, that's where I depart from the review a little bit, is where it talks about doing more to tackle Islamist extremism and the kind of socio-political problems that Rash identified. I don't think Prevent should be doing that. I don't think it's worth having a counter-extremism strategy that should do that. I think there are real fundamental basic things that need to be done to kind of preserve the functions of British liberal democracy that we're really failing at. And that doesn't even come close to being a counter-extremism strategy issue or a Prevent strategy issue. So I would disagree with the review on expanding that even further. And I think that leaves it open to more mission creep and more of the kind of accusations or suspicion against it in the first place. But maybe we can come to in the discussion what those things that are left untouched by doing that are. But that's it from me.
Great. Thank you, Liam. Really appreciate it. Let me shift gears drastically and move to the US. We've heard quite a bit about the UK, very interesting conversation. I would like to get Brit in the conversation and have her speak a bit about how this very British conversation has historically influenced the US debate on CVE, on prevention, And then also what's going on in the US. Of course, in the UK, we're having these very robust conversations. In the US, the whole thing seems to have, to some degree, fizzled out if you compare it to 5-6 years ago. So, Britt, just let us know a bit what's happening in the US on that front.
All right, thank you, Lorenzo. As Lorenzo mentioned at the beginning, I am the Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute. I also chair the Prevention Practitioners Network, which is a national network of interdisciplinary professionals dedicated to preventing targeted violence and terrorism across the United States. I actually want to start by commending the Home Office for commissioning this review. The McCain Institute has 3 of our programs under evaluation, independent academic evaluation right now. This is an emerging field. It's really important to open ourselves up for these independent reviews and then actually engage the results, just as we're doing today. Targeted violence and prevention in the United States looks similar in some ways with the UK and very different in others. And so I'll lay that out here. First, highlighting what it looks like, some big contrasts, some differences, and then, as Lorenzo mentioned, the impact of conversation about PREVENT in the UK for prevention efforts in the US. So I am going to contest Lorenzo's assessment. The efforts in the United States are actually more numerous and better funded than ever. The perception that they've fizzled out largely comes from the fact that they are not as covered in the media as they once were. They are not as subject to misinformation. But let's be clear, they are still subject to misinformation. And there's less controversy around them. In many cases in the United States, the approach that local partners have taken is to find existing programs that, like crisis intervention teams in schools, in universities, and youth resilience programs, et cetera, and adapt those programs to also address violent extremism, because let's be clear, we have a very real school shooting problem in this country. We have a lot of infrastructure in the United States that was built around the need to reduce school violence. And there are opportunities for working with those programs to also be able to handle all forms of targeted violence, including violent extremism, rather than creating standalone programs. So the programs get less publicity because you're adapting something that's already existing and working in a local framework. But there are, in fact, more of these programs than ever before. And we're seeing a lot of really promising experimentation. That said, programs in the United States are very diverse. There is no top-down system like there is in the UK, with only 130 jurisdictions where you have nationalized social services and you can mandate every jurisdiction will set this up. In the US, there are over 18,000 local law enforcement entities, for example. And I in no way mean to claim that all of them have prevention programs, because they do not. Instead, what we see in the US is a diverse array of programs established by universities, by hospitals, by community-based organizations, by school threat assessment teams, by mental health providers at the county level, for example, or by law enforcement. So rather than one clear structure that's replicated across every jurisdiction, we've seen experimentation through all of these different entities hosting programs. We have pockets of innovation in regions across the country, and we also have a lot of areas across the country that don't have any programs that specifically address violent extremism yet. Differences between PREVENT in the UK and targeted violence and terrorism prevention in the US. First, we have a different threat landscape. As the review notes, only 20% of cases in the UK come from the violent far right. Many government officials, senior government officials in the annual threat briefing continue to confirm that violent white supremacy, or as the government calls it, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, continues to be the dominant threat that we're seeing in the US now. So different threat landscape is going to lead to a different threat prioritization. We also have a different scope, and this goes to what Liam was saying a moment ago. The UK, for quite some time now, as Alex mentioned, has focused on preventing extremism, not just violent extremism. The US, for reasons having to do with our Constitution, among other reasons, focuses on that nexus to violence. So preventing targeted violence is the framing in the US. Targeted violence is inclusive not just of terrorism, but also of active shooter incidents like Las Vegas, where we may never know the motive, and school shootings, as well as workplace violence. So any type of violence where an attacker intentionally goes to commit an attack amongst an identified group. For reasons that go beyond a personal score to settle and intend to have a broader effect on the population. The review really focused on ideology, as discussed by Liam and others. Here in the United States, most of our programs are ideologically agnostic. They will take a similar individualized approach to an intervention with an individual leaving the violent far right as an individual leaving ISIS, for example. In the UK, they have the PREVENT duty, as discussed earlier on this call, a duty for teachers and others to report when they have concerns that an individual may be radicalizing to violence. Here in the US, we have the much less defined, if you see something, say something. And the critique frequently from individuals is see what and to whom. So there's no duty in the same sense that you see the PREVENT duty in the UK. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we just have an abundance of jurisdictions. The 18,000 jurisdictions, as well as our federalism system in the United States, means that each of these jurisdictions, each of these localities, gets to decide for themselves what they want prevention to look like. We, at the Prevention Practitioners Network, try to surface promising practices, provide practice guides on different ways that organizations can go about setting up effective programs based on the systematic reviews and program evaluations available to date. But there's still that experimentation and diversity of programming at the local level. Now I'm going to turn to similarities briefly. In both the UK and the United States, there's a primary prevention element. In the UK, they have the Act Early campaign that was started fairly late in this review. In the US, the McCain Institute released this past summer Screen Hate, similar concepts of bystander awareness campaign, raising awareness among parents and concerned adults of how to interact with what youth are doing online, how to start a conversation, and where to go to seek help if they're concerned that someone they love might be in trouble. In addition, both the UK and the US have primary, secondary, and tertiary programs. So programs that go to the general public, like Act Early and Screen Hate, secondary programs for individuals at greater risk, and tertiary programs for individuals who have already decided that violence is justified in furtherance of their grievance. One of the things that really stood out to me in the report was the critique of the mixed, unstable, or unclear ideology. The reality we see in the United States is more and more cases come from individuals who are mixing and matching the ideologies or the grievances that resonate most with them that they find online. You cannot structure a prevention program around a narrow concept of, in order to be a white supremacist, you believe this and only this. People are pulling from white supremacy, they're pulling from anti-government, they're pulling from incel, they're pulling from all of these various beliefs. And to say it's a problem because we're classifying people as mixed, unstable, or unclear just negates the reality of how radicalization and kind of access to ideologically fluid beliefs has changed over the last many years. Another point in similarity is prevention efforts in the United States really focus on curing vulnerabilities through addressing protective factors and reducing risk factors. This is something the reviewer critiqued, but critiqued in favor of saying you need to focus on the ideology. But practitioners and researchers have repeatedly found that if you challenge the ideology directly, people tend to double down. This has been confirmed in systemic reviews that if you take a biopsychosocial approach to addressing needs and strengths, you have a much greater chance of achieving the behavior change we ultimately seek. In the United States, we can't focus for government-funded programs. It's not about the beliefs. The beliefs are constitutionally protected. It's about the violent behavior. And so there, a biopsychosocial approach to behavior change is much more effective than challenging the beliefs directly. Both in the United States and in the UK, we do have a widespread misunderstanding of what prevention programs actually seek to do. And I think some of that misunderstanding is actually reflected in this report as well. And one final point of contention I will say is not every case is appropriate for intervention. There seems to be an assumption in this report that you've got to use these tools, use these prevention tools to intercept and prevent everyone. In the United States, prevention was seen as a supplement, an additional tool to traditional law enforcement tools, rather than expected to prevent every single case. For some individuals who have already committed to a course of violence, they have an imminent intent to perpetrate harm on themselves or others. Those cases aren't appropriate for intervention. Those cases may require a criminal justice outcome. However, you can still provide support to those individuals in the form of diversion programming, in the form of alternative dispositions. Rashad, I'm almost done. And other types of programming along those lines. So I'm not saying they don't deserve any support, but you can't expect prevention to address the needs of everyone. There are ways in which prevention programs may be most effective for those individuals who do have biopsychosocial needs that can be addressed through these intervention programs. I'm not saying I agree with the approach of any form of extremism is appropriate here. We do need that nexus to violence, as Liam was suggesting. But really looking at which cases are most appropriate. And then finally, Lorenzo asked me to address the impact of the discussion of PREVENT on the United States. From the outset in 2011, when the United States first revealed its national strategy to empower local partners to prevent violent extremism in the United States, we were met with critiques and assumptions that this was PREVENT in the US. So we have always, from day one, faced assumptions and just often misinformation that what we're doing is PREVENT in drag. As I said, there are vast differences from these programs. There are also great opportunities to learn from what other partner nations are doing. And we do seek to learn from the UK, from Canada, from Australia, and others. So absolutely, this debate crosses the pond. Every time PREVENT is in the news, we face a new wave of critique of programs in the United States. But we also have a lot to learn in both directions. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brett. Thank you so much. And I do stand corrected. You're perfectly right in contesting what I said about the programs in the US having fizzled out. What I meant is that the conversation, at least in the public, has somewhat fizzled out, for better or for worse. But indeed, I'm aware that whether it's at the community level, or supported by government at all level, local level, federal level, there's been quite a lot going on over the last few years. But you're perfectly right in making that more specific. So we have basically around 20 minutes left. That's not a lot of time. And basically we have a lot of questions coming from the audience. So what I would like to do is a quick round of questions going in reverse, so starting with Brett and ending with Alex, in which I'll ask you guys a couple of questions each, and I'll do the terrible thing of asking you to respond to them in a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes each. And I don't know if that's doable, but I hope you guys can do that. So let me start with Brett, and I have just 2 questions for you. One is about the mix and match of ideology, what you talked about, the salad bar extremism, as it's now being called. And the question is there a difference in who is vulnerable? Who are the people who sort of radicalize using this mix and matches of ideologies? Second question, I would say it's a bit more complicated and tricky, built on what Rashad mentioned as the far right being more of a socio-political problem. And the question is, how can we reconcile the future of CVE programming, especially in the US post-January 6th, where socio-political and security issues regarding the far right seem to be intertwining? Not easy questions to answer in 3 minutes, but let's see.
All right, especially that second one. So is there a difference in who's vulnerable when people are mixing and matching? Historically, a lot of recruiting for violent extremism was done face-to-face. Now what we're finding is a lot of individuals seeking out information online and finding these different narratives or these different grievances that most resonate with themselves. So you have individuals that are searching for something, and particularly they may be isolated, they may be alienated, they may kind of struggle with a number of personal as well as social factors, and they are searching out dynamics of this ideology rather than being directly recruited. That still happens in some cases, but we're seeing a lot more individuals finding it for themselves online. On the intermixing with political question, it's a phenomenal question and one we've grappled with a lot since January 6th. The McCain Institute spent a year and a half beginning in 2019 to develop a policy blueprint, a bipartisan policy blueprint to end white supremacist violence in the United States, and had phenomenal conversations with both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, before January 6th and in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. As that event became further politicized, it became much more difficult to get that bipartisan support publicly on the same policies that there had been support on historically, because the issue of violent extremism, violent far right, or violent white supremacy, pick how you want to frame it, had been so politicized in the aftermath of January 6th. And so we really need to identify those ways in which, and again, this nexus to violence is really important, those ways in which we can focus on the violence and try and forge those bipartisan partnerships wherever possible.
Excellent, thank you. Liam, bunch of questions that go on the point on what to do with groups, individuals and groups that do not cross that threshold into violence, whether Prevent or other programs should be targeting them, and if so, how? Should that be something that Prevent does? I've heard recently Sarah Khan at a policy exchange event saying that she thinks that there should be a separate strategy, having nothing to do with, or at least having only some connections to Prevent, but separate. What's your take on that? What is the British government doing on that front? There's a question that asks whether there should be something done similar to what the French are doing on separatism. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, good question. Can I just really quickly, before I answer that, just talk about, I think I saw a question in the Q&A, but it's something that's like lingered over all of this as well, is about the reviewer himself, William Shawcross. So I just think it's a real shame, and I think it behooves everybody who's working on this and writing on this publicly to not let, you know, I mean, in Shawcross's case, I've never met the man. I don't know him. I don't really have a particular, you know, concern for defending him as a person. I think on principle, the point is about not letting somebody's, you know, 50, 60 year, in his case, career in like humanitarianism, in the charity sector, in journalism, being boiled down to like half a sentence taken out of context and then being used to destroy the man's reputation and all of that. Like that could, I think a degree of what has happened to him has happened to pretty much everyone on this call, I think. But, you know, if you've got any kind of public platform, you do any kind of writing, I think it behooves all of us not to buy into that kind of thing and like to recognize it for the smear campaign that it is. I think it's really unfortunate that actually some practitioners have bought into the smears against Shawcross as well. Like that is pretty blatant what is happening. And, you know, you can go back and find the record of what he said, and the half sentence out of context, which is being portrayed as, is not what he actually said. So I think, you know, if any of us want to have a future where we're not destroyed over half a sentence, it's important to resist that kind of thinking. Sorry, just wanted to get that off my chest, and it's completely not what you asked. On the non-violent side, I think like this has become massively into view in the UK to do with like blasphemy affairs as much as anything, but to do with all sorts of different issues as well. I'm not of the view that Prevent should be taking this stuff on. I'm skeptical of like another strategy to deal with it if that just meant let's go out and do some workshops about British values and like what it means to be, you know, to not be an extremist. I think what it needs is, you know, I know we don't have a constitution written down in the United Kingdom in the way that the United States does, but like it needs a more vigorous protection of what we have in terms of a constitution, and more vigorous. Rash and I talked about this before, and it comes down to, you know, the funding towards certain groups. Is government taxpayer funding getting towards the certain groups that it shouldn't be? Are certain organizations running schools? Because we know that Hizb ut-Tahrir, Muslim Brotherhood linked organizations run schools in the United Kingdom, but there's not a whole lot done on anything to do with that. None of that's a Prevent or a counterterrorism issue, but I think there needs to be broader thinking about how to tackle these things and how to curb the influence of organizations which want to, and again, I know we don't have a written formal constitution, but would tear up the constitution as we know it and throw it away. And I just don't think we're getting those things right. And it comes down to, it even goes down all the way down to like local engagement for police officers and local councils engaging with groups, which Hannah mentioned that there probably shouldn't be, but all the way up to central government funding going to the wrong sorts of groups. I don't think that takes a strategy to deal with that. It's certainly not one that is looking at British values workshops or critical thinking workshops. I think that's about just getting the basics right of preserving the functioning democracy, like I said before.
Excellent. Thank you. Rashad, I know you had your hand up. I believe you wanted to say something, so I'll give you some space for that. But I do also have two questions for you, which are quite technical, although they all lend themselves to long answers, ideally. One is about prisons and probations. What's being done on that front? And the second one is about assessment tools. How those are being improved. It kind of goes to the hard question, which is, does prevent work? And I know that's a simplified way of putting it, but when channels put out certain numbers, they're quite interesting, and they give you, they can be interpreted, of course, but they give you a certain view as to whether it works or not. And again, I know there's a lot of analysis that can be done of those numbers. So yeah, those two questions and your comment.
Yeah, thank you. I guess there's a couple of things regarding those. I mean, they are very, very complicated questions, actually. But they actually relate to one of the points I was going to make, which is anything related to intervention isn't predefined by the channel process. So the methodology for interventions, there's a vast array, and we've kind of published quite a bit of it on this, looking at what are the approaches to interventions, those that center ideology, those that center looking at the psychosocial aspect, those that center looking at treating the individual as in a therapeutic methodology. There are those that look at religion specifically, and there are those that look at social needs and so on. In my experience across Europe, the US, the UK, with all of the talk of the different approaches taken by all of these places, they're all in practice almost remarkably the same. They all look at individual, the environment, the social factors, the influences, the various issues pertaining to, attitudes, behaviors, and the things that influence them. And they all approach it in that way, which brings to the question of, does it work? How do you assess it? The assessment tools. I am not the biggest fan of the assessment tools that we have. I say this as someone who's a practitioner who's been involved in counterterrorism interventions for more than 10 years and the delivery of them. And I haven't been for the last 6 months or so. But actually, I think the tools lack a lot, because they don't deal with really understanding the cognitive and behavioral aspects of individual psychology, and then how to measure change. Because essentially, you're not talking about, has this person de-radicalized, which is a question that is flawed from the beginning. What you're really saying is, are the cognitive and behavioral changes happening with this individual, which means that they are no longer likely to undertake this behavior? Those types of things are actually much more measurable and evaluatable than people think, and then critics critique it with. That's the first thing, without going into that, because that will take, happy to have another session on that one day. And I know we tried to discuss this on a paper that I did for you guys for the program on extremism before, looking at how does prevent measure and evaluate interventions. There was one minor point. So you mentioned two questions. That was the first one. The second one was, or was that the second one? Can't hear you, Lorenzo. You're muted.
You think of the 3 years of Zoom, I would know. One was about prisons and probations. The other was about tools and assessment. So you're pretty much there.
Yeah. So prisons and probations, ever since the inception of Prevent, actually people have been working within prisons and probations. However, it's not been formally designated as part of the strategy. So I've been working within prisons and probations since the beginning of it, since 2008 and 2009. And we've worked on many, many cases, returnees, foreign fighters that have been convicted, foreign fighters that haven't been convicted of anything, individuals that are convicted of terrorism acts or violent acts, and individuals being released. So that whole gambit of individuals, maybe 70 or 80 of those cases that I've worked with, which, by the way, many of them have, I would say, when I say many, I mean probably the overriding majority have been ideologically, theology or ideology has been relevant and significant. And engagement and disengagement with them has been through what I call a kind of a Socratic approach of making them think through their ideas, values, motivations, have a realization of them and challenge the underpinning assumptions, whether that's theology, ideology, politics, grievances, whatever it may be. Often it is the case that it's ideology. In a small number of those cases, it's quite rooted theology, as in jurisprudence and misunderstandings and conceptions of it, and engaging with that. However, and I know Liam's not going to like this, but hopefully he won't have a comeback because there won't be time, is that there is a proportion of those individuals that come from a background where they have seriously disturbed mental health. Having said that, to lay the blame on mental health is fundamentally horrendous, because the idea that people with mental health problems are some kind of a threat is a fundamentally horrendous thing to say, because it's not generally the case. But is there a vulnerability that can be exploited? Yes. Are they disproportionately higher in the population of individuals? Yes. Are they all of them and necessarily the majority? No. And I know that isn't a helpful kind of discussion. I wasn't saying that Liam was suggesting that, but I think that's just a way of kind of putting it in that context. And the last thing, which is a point of fact, is that if there's an immediate threat of violence, that is not a prevention case. That's a pursue case. That will not be looked at under prevent. It will not go through to channel. They will not, have an intervention. It will go immediately to pursue. And it would be seen as a case that needs to be looked at. I'm not saying that should always be the case. It shouldn't. And lastly, the formalization of the probation and probations and prisons processes through what's called the DDP program. Again, I have lots of criticisms of that, which are far longer than we could talk about in this, but I think it's set up in a really, really problematic way. And I don't think Shawcross actually did review that, because I think that would have had a lot more issues to talk about, including the way reintegration is perceived for convicted terrorists post-offense.
Excellent. Thank you, Rush. Let's move to Hannah. Got a couple of questions about training. And I think you mentioned your time as a civil servant and so the mood, the vibe, you picked up the level of knowledge. And so questions about how are people who deliver Prevent being trained, and also people who interact with Prevent, we have questions about the school system, the education system, and how exactly and how intensely is the education sector trained to make referrals?
Well, not seeking to dodge my question. I actually think Liam might be better placed to talk about that, as he's delivered Prevent training. I mean, my short answer to that would be how well and how extensively? I mean, not enough and not well would be the short answer. And particularly with the education sector, I mean, I generally think, on balance, I support the introduction of the Prevent duty, but when it came in at such pace that public sector workers were being asked to respond to it without adequate training at all, in my view. And certainly from when I speak to people who've done the training, or people who are tasked with delivering it or creating the content, their experiences do tend, I mean, Liam spoke about it today, their experiences do tend to match that of William Shawcross's, in that sometimes there is the kind of the focus on what you're looking for in the far right is maybe what we might say low, the bar is a lot lower and than what's described on Islamist cases. And particularly for people working in the education sector, there certainly polling over recent years has suggested that there's a lack of familiarity both with Islam as a religion, but Islamism specifically, the ideology, and a concern about confusing actions to know whether they are actually a sign of radicalization or whether they're just merely expressions of religious practice. And if we're asking teachers, social workers, GPs, anybody who works for an institution where this duty applies, to understand that with very limited and often online training, that's a really big ask. These are really complex issues, and a lot of it is sort of e-learning where you do the module yourself. That sort of stuff, yes, that you can do that for example, what are your responsibilities in terms of an IT policy? What do you need? What filters do you need to have? But when you're talking about really complex stuff, I think you need to have much better and much more informed in-person training for public sector workers. That's a big ask, but that's what the Shawcross review recommended. I also think a key thing around training was that he really pushed for there to be training, not just for frontline workers. We often kind of put it all on them. But if you think that the disparity that he reported was seen in the creation of the training itself and in the research and analysis, I think there's a case for people in the Home Office working on Prevent, the people at the centre, those officials as well as the frontline workers, to actually go through that training. So I know that when I was hired by the Commission, I wasn't given any training on different forms of extremism. Neither was any of my team. I had to organise that myself.
Excellent. All right. We basically have 2 minutes left, and Alex, I think a lot of us have touched on the topic of the anti-prevent lobby, the criticism, sometimes fair, sometimes maybe less fair, that exists from activist groups. I think a lot of people will have said that when you go deep in the community, you'll find that actually the vast majority of people in Muslim communities in the UK are quite keen to work on Prevent. There's been polling done showing quite favorable opinions of Prevent, and those are not reflected, of course, in the views you'll see coming from advocacy groups and parts of academia. Can you go a bit deeper on this?
Yes. So yeah, as you said, the polling that has been done of British Muslims is vast majority of the public haven't heard of it, doesn't impact their life. But even for those who haven't heard of it, they support the concept of it when presented with it. And yes, I mean, I'm probably something of an outlier. I mean, you mentioned a report I wrote covering kind of a lit review of Prevent for the Counter-Extremism group. Generally, I'm sympathetic to Prevent, and that puts me in a minority in British academia and in academia in general. And the problem I have so generally, your average kind of British academic who covers this does think Prevent is essentially institutionally racist and is designed to prevent Muslims from expressing themselves politically and to create suspect communities, as they've coined this term, kind of treating them perhaps how Irish people were treated unfairly, of course, in the early years of the Troubles, and particularly sort of saying this is all being done again. That's not to say a lot of it hasn't been ham-fisted, especially at the start. Yes, targeting Muslim, or areas with 5% or more Muslims doesn't look good, but it kind of just reflected the focus at the time. But in the end, a lot of the criticism of Prevent are theoretical, and they draw from kind of critical theories rather than actually based in the facts. Of course, we've seen Prevent adjust to deal with the extreme right threat. People still aren't happy with that. I mean, they would rightly point out that the majority of referrals to channel today are for the extreme right. I think it's about, the difference between the referrals to extreme right and Islamists are something like 4 to 5%. But they would point out, of course, that proportionally, you still have many more Muslims being referred to Prevent. That is still the case. So that, and I've seen some people claim theoretically that this because now if you read Prevent documents, it focuses as much on the extreme right as it does on Islamism. And critics aren't happy with that. You can't really placate them. And one of the criticisms I saw, kind of theoretical attempt to kind of present that as this person referred to as institutional kind of color blindness. So essentially saying that, this is the equivalent of, white people saying they don't see race, in order to ignore the kind of plight of minorities. They're sort of applying that idea to Prevent and saying, this is just sort of color blindness on Prevent. This is them pretending, that it's all the same. And so they won't even, acknowledge that. And just my defense of Prevent, despite all of its issues on a kind of macro scale, is that, if it didn't exist, it would be the progressives and the kind of people who are criticizing it, because this largely comes from progressive liberals and media. They'd be calling for something like this to exist if it wasn't around, because this is, historically unprecedented soft power attempt to, in many cases, empower minority communities to help their youth not break the law, not criminalize them. A lot of money spent to ensure they don't become criminals. A lot of effort being put in to make sure they're not criminalized, giving them an opportunity to change their path before they do something stupid, before they break the law. And that doesn't exist in many other countries. Other countries pursue much more aggressive, sting-based approaches that, wait for people to commit a crime before doing anything about it. Here we have a program that is, making a huge effort to not do that. And I think there's a very clear progressive case for a soft power CT strategy like this. It's just a pity that, when it was, and like a lot of it, when the ideas were presented, there was not a huge amount of thinking about how it was implemented. And there've been a lot of hard lessons being learned along the way. And it's lost a lot of kind of PR battles. I just think really mostly it should boil down to intervention programs like Channel. I don't think they should bother too much with counter messaging. There's basically very little evidence that it works. I could go on. But yes, I think they're actually, funnily enough, despite much of the criticism of Prevent coming from left-leaning institutions and media, it's actually quite a progressive approach to terrorism, counterterrorism.
Perfect. Alex, thank you so much. And we could go on for a long time. We've gone over time, so apologies to everybody for that. But thank you, everybody that tuned in for this. We had very good numbers, so I'm very happy that people all over the world tuned in for this. Everybody would virtually join me in thanking all the panelists today for sharing their insights. So thank you very much to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the next POE event. Thank you.